Hi, everybody. This is SAAD. Today, I'd like to change topics from the recent past, where I've been, covering a lot of the tsunami of lunacy that is taking hold of the West, and I'd like to return to science and specifically focus on a very important epistemological issue in science, and that is, how do we judge research? So there are many ways to judge it. Is it practical? Is it useful? Is it surprising? Is it novel? Of course, you'd like to think that any research that is published is going to have some required element of novelty. You're adding to the pantheon of knowledge. One issue, of course, that regrettably doesn't get enough attention is how interesting the research is. Now, of course, you can argue you can't discuss tastes. You can't debate tastes. I like maybe juicy steak. You like chocolate ice cream. Yet there is a general phenomenon that links both of our respective preferences, and that is we both prefer fatty foods to, say, raw celery. And so, is there something, notwithstanding the fact that people have different aesthetic senses, is there some set of criteria that we could use in evaluating what we consider to be interesting scientific research? Now, in my own work as a professor, I put on many hats. I'm a teacher in the classroom. I am someone who is publishing peer-reviewed scientific papers. I'm also someone who is reviewing papers. And so probably of all my years of having reviewed papers for all sorts of journals in many, many different disciplines and, all sorts of prestigious journals, probably the number one criticism that I've levied is the fact that the research was not interesting. So the methodological rigor was there, the theoretical rigor was there, all the controls were in place, so the mechanics of science were very well executed. But then the bottom line was terribly banal. And this is something that I teach my students to be mindful of. Now, again, I'm never suggesting that one should relax their exacting standard of what constitutes maximally rigorous science. If anything, I set the bar on everything way higher than it needs to be. But what I'm saying is that methodological rigor and conceptual rigor and theoretical rigor are insufficient. They are just what allows you to enter the club. We expect you to do rigorous science, but can you do good science? I mean, interesting science. And so here, the reason why this is on my mind, other than the fact that I always assign the paper that I'm about to discuss with you now to certainly my graduate students and certainly my doctoral students. I've even asked questions on comprehensive exams using the paper that I'm about to talk to you about next. I'm writing currently a paper for a journal called Psychology and Marketing, where I'm going to be raising many of the points that I'm discussing in the current video. So there's this paper from 1971 by a sociologist named Davis. So the reference, I'll put the link to the full reference to any of the professors or graduate students who might be listening to this clip, or anybody else who's interested. It's a great, great paper, a classic. It should be read by everybody. So the paper is titled "That's Interesting!" in reference to the fact that can you do scientific research that triggers that response in you? And so here there are many, many quotes. So this is actually one of the first lectures that I have in my MSc and PhD course on consumer psychology and psychology of decision making. Is we talk about what is science, what is good science, what is interesting science. And so, of course, I go into this paper in great depth. So there's an amazing quote here that I'd like to read for you from this guy here, Davis. Let me see where it is. The most common critique of most contemporary social and especially sociological research is that it is dull, that it says what everybody knows or what nobody cares about. It is this defect in the way the social sciences are generally practiced today, perhaps more than any other single reason, which is responsible for the relatively low status of their disciplines, for the relatively low ability they have to attract superior students for the relatively low enthusiasm they arouse in the public and even in their own practitioners. This is from a quote from Davis, 1971, page 336. And this was published nearly 40 years ago, and the same holds true today, which is a lot of research in general, not just in the social sciences, but certainly in the social sciences, is very, very esoteric, doesn't necessarily link up to any epistemological measure of, wow, that's interesting. But boy, is it methodologically rigorous. Now, I have a theory that I've espoused for many years as to why this happens in the social sciences. Now, of course, this hasn't made me popular with some of my colleagues in the social sciences, and you'll see in a second why. But as you know, I speak the truth unencumbered by political correctness. I think that a lot of the methodological and theoretical rigor that we see in economics, in the behavioral sciences, in quantitative sociology and so on. I'm not talking about parasitized fields with ideology. Even very serious social scientists, they're very much driven by methodological rigor as a replacement of interestingness. And the reason for that is because they're ultimately insecure about their place at the table of sciences. So I want to demonstrate to you that I'm a very serious, rigorous scientist. And the way that I do that is if it whacks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it talks like a duck, then it must be a duck. So I must be a real scientist because I have all sorts of fancy mathematical models, all sorts of incredibly complicated factorial design, experimental designs, all sorts of moderation and mediation analysis. Now, the bottom line is the final research question is profound bullshit. It's completely uninteresting. It's terribly trivial. And everyone could have predicted it a priori. So customers who love the restaurant are more likely to return to the restaurant. God damn, who could have predicted that? But it is couched in incredibly fancy methodological rigor, and you do a causal model and a Lisrel analysis and mediation and ANCOVA and MANOVA. For those of you who know statistical design, I'm just listing a whole bunch of random designs or data analytic approaches. And so it looks fancy, therefore that's what we care about. Well, no, we spend a lot of time and effort and taxpayer money doing science. Well, then we should hopefully be doing something that is also triggering the curiosity, the excitement of the consumers of our research, not just the 6 people who otherwise might read your peer-reviewed paper in some arcane journal. So I wanted to first read you the 12 criteria that Davis listed. So I'm going to literally quote them. I'm going to read all of them. He had 12 criteria which he considered if your research is at least catering to one of these criteria, then you're at least hopefully doing interesting research. Now, I hardly think that his approach is the perfect one. It's one of many ways that one could try to measure interestingness, but at least it's a formal attempt to provide some framework to determine what is or isn't interesting. So here we go. So I'm going to list the 12 criteria, as I said, and just read each one. So the first one he talks about is organization. What seems to be disorganized or unstructured phenomenon is in reality an organized or structured phenomenon. So you thought it was A, it turns out to be not A. What seems to be an organized, structured phenomenon is in reality a disorganized, unstructured phenomenon, the opposite example. So that's organization. Composition, number 2. What seemed to be assorted heterogeneous phenomena are in reality composed of a single element. You thought it was a multiplicity of factors, but it's really driven by one factor. Or what seems to be a single phenomenon is in reality composed of assorted heterogeneous elements. Number 3, abstraction. What seems to be an individual phenomenon is in reality a holistic phenomenon. Or what seems to be a holistic phenomenon is in reality an individual phenomenon. So you see the structure of his examples or criteria. Number 4, generalization. What seems to be a local phenomenon is in reality a general phenomenon. What seems to be a general phenomenon is in reality a local phenomenon. Number 5, what seems to be a stable and unchanging phenomenon is in reality an unstable and changing phenomenon. Or the corollary, what seems to be an unstable and changing phenomenon is in reality a stable and unchanging phenomenon. And then number 6, what seems to be a phenomenon that functions ineffectively as a means for the attainment of an end is in reality a phenomenon that functions effectively. What seems to be a phenomenon that functions effectively as the means for the attainment of an end is in reality a phenomenon that functions ineffectively. I hope I read that correctly. Number 7, evaluation. What seems to be a bad phenomenon is in reality a good phenomenon, or what seems to be a good phenomenon is in reality a bad phenomenon. Sorry if this sounds tedious, but at least I want you to have on record the 12 criteria. And again, I hardly think that this is the only approach for measuring interestingness, because again, you can see as I read through the rest of these criteria that in a sense he's talking about surprising research as being synonymous with interesting. You thought A, but it's not A. You thought not A, but it's A. Correlation, number 8. What seems to be unrelated independent phenomena are in reality correlated interdependent phenomena, or what seems to be related interdependent phenomena are in reality uncorrelated independent phenomena. Number 9, coexistence. What seem to be phenomena which can coexist together are in reality phenomena which cannot exist together. Say, for example, me and occasional cortex. We cannot coexist on the same earth. What seem to be phenomena which cannot exist together are in reality phenomena which can exist together. By the way, for those of you who don't follow me much, occasional cortex refers to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. All right, number 10, covariation. What seems to be a positive covariation between phenomena is in reality a negative covariation between phenomena, or the corollary, what seems to be a negative covariation between phenomena is in reality a positive correlation between phenomena. You thought that income and education were positively correlated. It turns out that they are negatively correlated. Okay, that would be the example here. Number 11, opposition. What seem to be similar, nearly identical phenomena are in reality opposite phenomena. What seem to be opposite phenomena are in reality similar, nearly identical phenomena. And finally, causation, number 12 of the 12 criteria. What seems to be the independent phenomenon variable is in a causal relation is in reality the dependent phenomenon variable. What seems to be the dependent phenomenon or variable in a causal relationship is in reality the independent phenomenon and variable. So those are the 12 criteria of Davis 1971. Now I think I'm trying to come up with my own formal way to define interesting research. And again, as someone who applies evolutionary theory in the behavioral sciences in general and in consumer psychology in particular, I navigate through both the worlds of the natural sciences and the social sciences. I get to read papers in top journals in both areas. And almost always when I open up a top journal in evolutionary theory, say Evolution and Human Behavior, almost every single paper triggers in me the "that's interesting" exclamation point. But then I read sometimes papers in top consumer behavior journals, and again, top researchers, very rigorous training, very smart individuals, but I fall asleep after about the third letter. Why is that? Well, again, I think it's because the nature of the types of phenomena that people study in evolutionary theory is simply more prone to triggering the visceral effect of "that's interesting." Now, I don't yet have a formal way of defining what I just said, but what I can tell you for sure is that the social sciences are drowning in methodological rigor, in methodological rigor on steroid that is unnecessary, right? What I mean by unnecessary is it becomes compensatory. You're trying to compensate for the bullshit research question that you're asking by having very sophisticated process explanations. That's a waste of time. My good friend, Professor Michel Pham, who's been on my show, by the way, quite a while ago, he was the president of the Society for Consumer Psychology several years ago, and he authored an article in the journal Consumer Psychology, a great top journal, where as president of the society, where he talked about the 7 sins of consumer psychology. And one of the things that I argue in my work, and I might again explain in the paper that I'm currently working on, is that each of the 7 sins that he enumerates in his paper are beautifully addressed by incorporating evolutionary thinking within the study of consumer psychology. And that, the point that I just made, applies to many other disciplines. In other words, the idea that you could study biological beings, in this case consumer beings, without any reference to their biological heritage, to their ancestral heritage, makes no sense. It can't be that you could study every single other species on Earth while referring to biology, but somehow humans are exempt from that treatment. So there you have it, folks. This is the type of stuff that you would get if you were my students in one of my courses. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have, please consider supporting the channel any way that you can. I will be also posting this clip on my podcast. If you've not subscribed to the podcast, for those of you who don't know, about 2 weeks ago, almost 3 weeks ago, I listened to all of the requests that people have made over the past few years, and I'm trying to now migrate all of my, well, not migrate, but to upload all of my YouTube content to my podcast. So I hope that you'll subscribe to it, and wish you all a great weekend, and get out there safely, have fun, and enjoy life. Take care, everybody. Cheers.